Good morning and welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Steve Reed. I'm a pastor at H2O Church in Orlando and a licensed mental health counselor. This is the place where we take bite-sized pieces of mental, emotional, and spiritual health. We seek to grow in our awareness because awareness can give room for movement, and movement can lead to freedom, and it is for freedom that Christ set us free. So as we're thinking about a number of different things, July is for freedom. And we have looked at a number of different things, two specific areas to move towards freedom in already. And one of those is intrusive thoughts. And we've recognized that each of us have about 500 different kinds of intrusive thoughts a day. And that most of them are just run-of-the-mill, ordinary, normal, I need to get toothpaste on my way home, or whatever else. And then some of them fall into more of those disruptive categories, and we talked about how to navigate those. And then last week we talked about Daniel Amen's research on automatic negative thoughts that he calls ants, and how to stamp out ants. And so we want to recognize that those two categories are really, really helpful, and those two processes of moving through intrusive thoughts or automatic negative thoughts are very, very solid and helpful. And we also want to recognize this morning that some of those intrusive thoughts, even some of those automatic negative thoughts, may come from a specific moment in my heart's life that was traumatic, or moments that were traumatic. And so this morning what we're going to be looking at is freedom from trauma. And as we take a look at this together, we're only going to be able to scratch the surface. There is so much in the area of trauma and moving towards freedom from trauma that in a short moment here this morning together, we obviously can't tackle everything. But I want to give a little bit of an overview so that there is an orientation that we can have that recognizes, is that experience that I just had, that thought that just went through my mind, that image that just hit me, is that from trauma or is it not from trauma? And so the interesting thing is our hearts and our heads were made in a very unique way by God. If we were to, for a moment, think about a difficult memory that we had growing up, an embarrassing moment, a scary moment, an assaulting moment, a time when it was just really hard, there's a number of things that would happen. And in trauma work, we look at 4 different memory components. Okay, the first memory component is that image that comes up with that memory. It might be that I have a memory of a place and time that was very scary for me. And it's interesting because on that day, even though it was 40 years ago, I might remember what I was wearing or where I was in the color of the wall. So there's this image in my brain. And if you asked me anything else about that image, I might be able to tell you something, I might not. It might be just a few details. It might be that there's so many details that I remember. But if you asked me about something a week before that, I'm not sure I could tell you. But that memory I do. And I remember there's a message that came with that moment. So there's an image and there's a message, a cognition. And that cognition says something about me, usually something on an identity level. I'm bad, I'm worthless, I'm not safe. There's a number of different things. I'm powerless. It might be hitting me because of what happened in that moment. The third thing is my emotions and what wells up inside of me as I move towards, in my memory, that specific moment in time. And then also I will oftentimes have a physiological response. My gut got tight when I started thinking about that, or my jaw or my chest tightened, or I felt some pain in some place in my body. So those 4 different memory components are things to just be aware of, because they potentially are an indicator that there is a trauma level in this memory that has come into my mind. And it's not necessarily just a normal automatic negative thought or an intrusive thought. It could be a trauma-triggered thought. And the interesting thing is that the way that all comes into our mind is the way God has designed our brains. He's designed our brains to grab a hold of things that are significant in a very, very significant way. And so if you're thinking about a 3-year-old little boy and he is smelling hot chocolate and he sees something steaming on the stove and he's starting to toddle over towards that hot chocolate and reaching for the stove, there is this image. He remembers what hot chocolate was like. There's this message, I love that taste, I'm feeling good, I'm about to reach for the stove, and all of these are narrative and emotional things. And if there are narrative neurons on one part of our brain and emotional neurons on the other part of our brain, and just as he's reaching for that stove, mom screams stop and he touches it anyway, there's this moment where those neurons fire together and they get wired together, and there is this memory lock. And that is how God has designed our brains to work. Now, most of the time that's helpful for us. They call that adaptive. It's helpful for us. If I am then that same little boy and I'm 3.5 and I smell hot chocolate on the stove, there's some narrative things that are going on, and as I smell and see the steam running, there's this memory from 6 months ago that comes screaming into here and now, and I remember what it was like to touch the stove and I don't go near it. And it's adaptive. It helps keep me safe. And so the past becomes present in a millisecond because the amygdala takes over. It doesn't have to go all the way through the routing of the prefrontal cortex. So that's really good and that's helpful. And it's great. It even helps me, if I'm that same little boy and I'm 5 years old and I'm playing soccer out in my front yard and someone kicks the ball out in the street and I start running out in the street and mom yells, stop! Again, that same memory comes screaming out of the past into the here and now and keeps me safe because I know that message is when I disobey mom, I get hurt. And so it's helpful to recognize that means of our brains holding on to memories is very solid and works great, and most of the time it's really, really helpful, except when it's not, right? Because there are those times when something that our heart has been through is traumatic like that, and there is this memory lock, but it was a bullying incident or it was a traumatic incident that when it is triggered, it comes into the here and now and it affects me in a negative way. Okay, that man who's been overseas or that woman who's been overseas in a war zone and has a loud explosion next to them and someone they care about has been hurt, comes away with this memory. Loud noises bring destruction, which they did, but it doesn't mean they do. And so there sometimes is a lie associated with that memory, and it's tied up in that. Loud noises bring destruction. So this man or woman, 7 years later in Topeka, Kansas, at their lunch table with their 3-year-old, is trying to sort out a great time together with their 3-year-old, and suddenly a car backfires out front and finds themselves underneath their kitchen table clutching their 3-year-old, because suddenly this happened and loud noises bring destruction, especially to people I care about. And so I also don't have freedom then to take my 3-year-old to watch fireworks, because my brain doesn't have access at that moment of a loud noise to realize the truth is that some loud noises can bring destruction, but some loud noises can bring delight. And so we want to be able to recognize that some of those intrusive memories, some of those automatic negative thoughts might be these moments that something happened in today that felt similar narratively or similar emotionally to a moment of trauma that my heart and head experienced maybe way back when, maybe 3 weeks ago. And it feels like it screams into the here and now as if it just happened. So we can recognize this as a trauma moment, especially if there is that image that's very, very clear. Suddenly I'm back there as if it just happened. Also, if there's that message about me that is oftentimes a negative message. And so if I have that trauma that screams into here, there's that image and there's that message about me and an emotional snap of intensity, and I can feel it in my body, there's a good chance that we're talking about a trauma memory. And so let's talk about a couple different kinds of trauma. The ones we've been talking about are those snap moments that where somebody is hurt or something I care about is hurt. There's also a different kind of trauma. We can call those traumas a big T trauma. Okay, there can be an accident I was in or an accident I witnessed. There can be sexual trauma. There can be bullying trauma. There's all kinds of different trauma that my heart might experience. There's also a kind of trauma that we might call little t trauma. And this is much more prevalent. Many of us have some kind of little t trauma. A little t trauma it has a little bit of pain. It's not like I lost my arm or something, but it is real pain. It might be emotional pain, it might be physical pain, but it builds up. And it builds up on top of the same message over and over and over, and it becomes something like a big T trauma, something that I'm very sensitive to when it happens. It still affects me as if it was a big T trauma. This might be that young person coming home from school and every day coming home to an open house, silent house, nobody there. Mom's gone, dad's gone, no siblings, and one person might love that and go play video games and love the silence, and another person might be hit by a moment of, oh no, I'm alone. I don't matter. If anyone's going to take care of me, it's got to be me. And so there is this moment every day walking in from school where there is that message that is assaulting my head and heart that says I don't matter. And it doesn't, it's an awareness, and then it grows and it grows, and then the challenge is lots of kids experience that, and some they experience it as trauma, some don't. But if, for instance, this same person has grown up and gotten married, and they are coming home from work or from school or from the store or whatever, and they expect their spouse to be there, and they walk in and it's silent, and suddenly they feel abandoned by their spouse. They begin to be suspicious of their spouse. What are they doing? And they start feeling it's all up to, this whole relationship is all up to me. If anybody, if I'm going to be loved, it's up to me. And so that same message from oh so many times growing up can affect me in the here and now in ways that I wouldn't necessarily expect. And oftentimes it's in that relational context that it's the most destructive. It screams a message into my head and heart that was true then, or at least my perception of it was true then, but it may not have anything to do with truth currently. And so the challenge is in being able to discern which is a trauma memory and which is just an intrusive thought or an automatic negative thought. So be thinking about one way to tell the difference. The most significant way to know if this is a trauma memory is how quickly the emotional rise happens. An emotional rise with a hard memory is fast, but it takes maybe half a second. And an emotional rise with a trauma memory, if it's triggered, is milliseconds. It's right there because the amygdala takes control and it short circuits all the wiring in the prefrontal cortex. So just kind of notice that when I have that thought and it hits me, is it all of a sudden I'm taken to that place of powerlessness or worthlessness or whatever that message is from that hard season that my heart went through. Just be aware of that. So there's different kinds of trauma. And with each one of them, there is going to be an awareness of this image that's in my mind. So that's the first memory component, this message about me that's usually on a identity level. There's this set of emotions that is triggered and fast, and there is oftentimes this body sensation. And so the reality with trauma is, if it's not bugging you, then don't do anything about it. I might have been through a traumatic experience, but it's not actually affecting my life in a discernible way these days, and so I don't need to do anything about it. If it does seem like it's affecting my peace, if it's affecting my relationships, if it's affecting my relationship with God, then there are things I can do about it, and they're on a number of different levels. The first one is on a processing level. If I notice that I got triggered, I can do two things. The first thing is I can practice some of the processes that we have looked at in other Mental Health Mondays. You can process by deep breathing, and if I got kicked out of my window of tolerance, I can draw my breath lower, I can draw my heart rate lower, I can just be able to calm myself down a little bit. In addition to that, I can do some journaling, and in the journaling I may want to write a story about this happened to me, and I want to write narratively and chronologically what are the things that happened since that time, and here I am today, and oh yeah, I'm safe now. And it helps the brain have some neural pathways that go all the way to here and now. We're going to talk a little bit more about that and some narrative work when we get to September, because September is for story. And so that's a way that we can deal with trauma. Take myself out, back into the window of tolerance, and then do a narrative work so that I can help my brain go, I'm okay now. Now, there are those that doing narrative work and being able to just calm down, it is besetting, it's something that keeps on attacking me. And so in that situation, I would encourage you to talk to a therapist, consider doing some trauma work. Most of the trauma work that is available these days is not the old style, which was called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is mostly re-traumatizing over and over until your brain has had so much that it's desensitized to it. That seems like a very cruel and unusual way to address something that is already assaulting me. And so I do not do that. I don't know any counselor that does exposure therapy these days. And so the therapy they would work on has to do with bilateral stimulation and the science that has been discovered that how and when our brains can release those locks. And so that would be something perhaps to look into. And so I hope that is a helpful little picture on trauma and trauma recovery. It is not necessary to address every piece of it. If I notice it's there, but it's not really bugging me, that's okay. The ones that tend to be the most insidious, that we are not sure if we ever should do something with it, are the ones that when we first think about it, they seem so small. That one, like every time I walked in the house, I was by myself after school, and it seems like that's just a big deal. There's so many latchkey kids, and why did this hit me the way it did? Well, for some reason that fit me in a different way. It hit me in a different way than it hit my siblings, perhaps. And that aloneness, I'm on my own, it's all up to me, kept on building and building and building. And now when I find myself alone, I find myself powerless. I find myself lacking love and having a challenge, confidently moving into a loving relationship, asking for things that I might need or request in a relationship. Affirmation or connection, just even reaching out can be difficult because this message is screaming at me, I'm all alone. And so those little T traumas that build up to a big T trauma are the most common kind of trauma to go unresolved and unaddressed in our lives, and yet they can be some of the most freeing to address because they can allow our brains then to connect to other pieces of truth. Yes, I was alone and on my own, but I'm not now, if I can navigate through to that trauma-cleared place. And so this is my heart towards yours, hoping that you can navigate through a whole set of things that our hearts and our heads encounter, whether they are intrusive thoughts, whether they are automatic negative thoughts, whether they are identified by your head and heart as a trauma moment. There is a pathway towards freedom, and it is for freedom that Christ set us free. Have a great week.